All right, welcome back everybody. I hope you're doing well. We're here for Act II of Romeo and Juliet. As all of them, they start with the prologue here, and I'll just say a couple things about this prologue. I think the first couple lines are interesting. We talk about desire in the personified sense, being on a deathbed, and I think we have to remember that desire has always been here on earth, and even for the creatures that surround us as well, right? There's this age-old understanding of desire, its control over us, right? So it says, old desire doth in his deathbed lie, and young affection gapes to be his heir. So we have desire coupled with this idea of young affection, young people falling in love and experiencing desire, maybe for the first time or the first, couple or few times. So we're coupling those things together. Desire will be here after we are, gone from this world. There will always be this idea of desire. It's a very powerful thing. We all just get to experience it in our own ways. The other thing I just want to mention here is line 6 in the prologue for Act 2 here. Alike bewitched by the charm of look. So you can't deny the power of sight in leading us astray, right? Because it's sight that doesn't allow us to see the interior qualities, or I should say internal qualities of a person. The sight is what keeps us from that, right? It can lead us astray. Okay, very good. Last thing they mention there is just that it's going to be difficult for these two young people to nurture this relationship based on all of the conflict and restrictions placed upon them, and even more so, it says, for Juliet, because she's a young woman. She has more of a monitoring of her life taking place. All right, let's get right into it. Very, very powerful and significant lines that we start with. Act 2, Scene 1. First two lines. Early line 2, turn back dull earth and find thy center out. Again, if I didn't have these text aids, and you can see for certain parts, they're robust, right? There's a lot of background, expository, illusory information that they provide here. So it's so important, and it enhances our reading of the book. It says, turn back dull earth and find thy center out. And what we're really saying here is dull earth is just the basic, simple thing that we are. We've been seeing the images of the James Webb telescope, and it's phenomenal, right? The detail we're seeing. But it reminds us too that we are basically just matter, right? Organisms that are lucky to be here in the first place, mashed together and thrown on this planet with all these temptations and desires that surround us. It reminds us of who we are, right? We are just of the earth. Ash Wednesday in the Catholic Christian tradition or whatever is all about just ashes. You come from the earth, you return to the earth, and that's the same for all of us, right? Me, Bezos, the owner of Amazon that we all partake in, or most of us, I should say. There's many of us. There's just at the end of the day, we all die. We all go right back into this earth and are eaten by worms or burnt up or whatever you prefer. And it's not necessarily a defeating idea. We don't feel bad about that. It's just the way things are. So he says, turn back dull earth and find thy center out. And what he talks about with find thy center out is finding Juliet, what the body craves. What does this organism crave? A lustful experience. He craves physical contact, right? That's what he wants. And this is what's leading him to Juliet, aka youthfulness, right? Benvolio and Mercutio are looking for him, mocking him for his kind of hopeless romanticism. So I'll kind of pass through most of this. You do get a lot of idiomatic speech here, especially from Mercutio, who's quite the wordsmith, probably the strongest wordsmith. In the play alongside Romeo, they battle in that regard, which is interesting. Who's kind of the wittier person with words. But a lot of this is an expression of sexual desire, and I don't need to go into too much detail, right? But you can see that there's a lot of, allusions to the male genitalia, right? Especially its arousal, right? Its application, things like that. I do think it's purposeful that we have nighttime occurring here, coupled with all this talk Mercutio and these other young men about sex, right? About what they believe Romeo is, and all of them for that matter, are truly looking for. I think that's why it occurs at night here, right? The nighttime is usually associated with parties and a kind of different type of behavior than the daytime, right? The more formal hours of the day. All right, Act 2, Scene 2. Act 2 is not that long of an act. Act 3 is the longest, right? So that's to come. All right, we get into Act 2, Scene 2. One thing I think we got to stop and smell the roses for a second. Romeo is a stalker, right? He's actually stalking Juliet. It's romantic, I guess, in some way, this balcony scene that we're about to have, but also it's a little bit creepy because he's actually, jumped over walls. He's kind of treaded territory he's not supposed to be in, and really it's the risk of death, right? If they find him there as a Montague and they kind of know who he is, they're going to kill him, right? And he's there anyways. So doing a lot to get to Juliet here, right? Really surpassing a lot of obstacles in the physical and social sense. Everything is based on sight, right? Everything is based on sight here. And his attraction to her is no more than that at this point in time. And you can ask yourself, will it stay that way? Well, we'll see. He talks about killing the moon. In Roman mythology, the moon is associated with the Greek goddess, I think, Diane, and that is a goddess who represents the idea of chastity. What Romeo is saying here is kill the moon, right? Juliet come out, he's associating her with the sun, which is idolatry because the sun is God, right? Especially in the pagan sense and where a lot of these beliefs, fuse. He's saying he wants this Juliet, the new sun, right? He's a heretic at this point, I guess you could say. Remember the last act, to destroy the moon, essentially to destroy chastity, right? I want this girl, and I want the physical sensation of sex here, right? So the chastity is going to have to go. And that's what he's telling us early on as he's looking upon Juliet, trying to find her. He even says, line 9, cast it off, right? Cast it off. Cast off that chastity. He then starts to get into words that, a description of Juliet that seems to rival the presence of God. Line 19 and 20, the brightness of her cheek would shame those stars as daylight doth a lamp. So this idea of shaming the stars that are in the sky, which again would probably traditionally be known to be under the kind of control of a monotheistic God, right, in this kind of belief. And so anything that shames that opposes it, right? It goes against it. It's trying to compete. The birds would sing and think it were not night, right? There's some other language here. We get a lot of language that serves as a premonition or a foreshadowing of their final death. And I don't want to say too much. I mean, it's obviously these two young people die, right? There's no spoilers here, but it's really where they end up. Where they end up is going to be in the crypt, right? In a place designed for death. And so I think you start to see some allusions to the body in that particular state. And I think it begins here. This is lines 29 and 30. They say when somebody looks at Juliet here, looks up at Juliet, it says, as like a winged, as is a winged messenger of heaven unto the white upturned wondering eyes of mortals that fall back to gaze on him. So when there's a winged messenger, maybe an angel, people have this look on their faces and their eyes like roll back right as they look up. When else do we start to see that expression on people's faces where the eyes turn upward? Death, right? So especially kind of laid out, right? Gone, just kind of gone from the world. So we're starting to see that a little bit here. And it's interesting too, because in their efforts, vain efforts, to compliment each other and say how beautiful they are, what they're really bringing themselves directly into and closer to every time they do it is their own death, right? So they think they're kind of praising themselves when they're really doing themselves in terms of the grand scheme here and what ends up happening. Let's see here. Juliet is on the balcony. She doesn't know Romeo's there yet. And she says out loud, I guess she's that kind of a person, she likes to talk out loud, her thoughts. She says, if thou wilt not be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. Notice that Juliet's so quick to want to change her name. Well, if the problem is that Montagues and Capulets can't mix, just name me Smith, right? And then it won't be a problem. Notice she's so quick to give up that familial identity, and we remind ourselves, who is a character that represents familial loyalty, and the strongest, and maybe even the only one, I'm not sure. The strongest example will be Tybalt, right? Who was infuriated at the party not that long ago because Romeo was there. So I just wanted to point that out. So quick to want to change their names. What about Tybalt? What about Tybalt's perspective on that? Romeo says, call me, this is line 50, call me but love and I'll be new baptized. Very sacrilegious, blasphemous, and probably serving that theme of idolatry more and more. I'll be but new baptized. This is way before the days of, I believe, born-again Christianity, which I think is a later development. I'm not sure, though. But when we talk about a baptism, especially, remember the time, it's Italy. That's when the play is set, including Shakespeare's time, I believe. You only get one baptism, and that's at birth. And that means you only get one name, because you get your name, right? Basically at this time too. So you can't change your name. It is yes, it's your parent guardian given name, but it's also your God-given name in that respect too. So for them to talk about new baptisms, right, is completely blasphemous. It was common to use religion and kind of blend it with romantic language back in the day, but I think this is on a different level, right? This is on a whole nother level. It's a little bit too dangerous. I always kind of use that word. What is Romeo trying to do? To get up on that balcony with Juliet so he can touch her, right? Be with her, be close to her physically. This is interesting because Montague, the name, right, that Romeo has, it translates to on a high hill or mountain, right? Mount, like mountain, right? You see mount in the name. So that's interesting. The idea of wanting to get to the peak of something, which could be metaphorically many different things, right? The peak of a career, the peak of a relationship, the peak of, leadership or whatever it could be. So it really speaks to getting to the top of that mountain. All right. Now, one thing we want to point out here is that Juliet is way more cautious, way more mature, way more rational-minded when thinking about what's happening here with this guy right underneath her balcony. He'll be killed if they see him. So she says, line 70, if they see thee, they will murder thee, right? And Romeo responds with just a kind of comical, heroic kind of response where he says, well, let it happen because there's more danger in not being with you than there is. It's totally, Romeo's almost out of his mind here as he wants to be up on that balcony with Juliet, right? Silly answers from Romeo. Juliet asks a serious question. How did you find out where I live, right? And Romeo says, by love, as if it's like the Google on our phones, right? By love that first did prompt me to inquire, line 80. I mean, it's just very romantic, romantic kind of language. Remember we talked about Rosalind. I will not stay she would not stay the siege of my words, right? Well, what's happening with Juliet? Are these words working, right? Because they're romantic and, I guess clever, but in terms of the real situation at hand, he seems like a fool here, right, doing what he's doing. Juliet also acknowledges here that Romeo has been eavesdropping, which is, I'll leave that up to you. Do you think that's a cool thing or not? So a lot of the truth that she's feeling about Romeo, normally he wouldn't know. Well, guess what? He knows, right? Because he's been listening to her as she's been saying all this. So she's kind of they say showing your cards, right? She's kind of shown her cards here because he's been listening in. And she goes on, and this is kind of a beautiful part. I won't say too much about it to save time where I can. But you read through lines 90 all the way down to 100, And she does express a real genuine feeling for Romeo, but it's still mixed with that idea of, you know, I want to kind of go about this the proper way. And she's putting a lot of thought into it. Let's always remind ourselves she's a 13, not even 14 yet, 2 weeks shy of being 14, going through a relationship, probably the first one. Nothing was really come of county parish yet. That's pretty fresh too. So she's going through this stuff for the first time, right? And she's got no one to really talk to. She's sharing her real thoughts with Romeo. I think she's being very real about things. Okay, but she says something dangerous here and very clear. Maybe so clear so as to show us as an audience that this is a major theme in the text. And this is going to be line 113. I'll just say 112 down through 114. Or if thou wilt swear by thy gracious self, gracious, only one gracious, God is gracious. Swear by thy gracious self, which is the God of my idolatry. She puts it pretty clearly. And remember, it's lowercase g on this God, which means not a true God from the monotheistic sense of things, right? So you see the lowercase g here. And I'll believe thee. I will follow thee. I will swear to be by your side, right? I will have faith in you. And in a way, it's kind of turning from the one true God. So we see that sin here, right? Remember, that's coupled with other things too. But it's not that just that they're falling for each other, that Juliet's falling for Romeo here, or Romeo's falling for Juliet. It's the youth that they contain. They're beautiful faces, right? They're limber bodies, right? And kind of agile and energetic selves, right? There's so much to youth that attracts us, right? Look at our media. Just look at everything. And you tell me, do we worship youth in our culture, 2022 kind of current day here? I'll let you be the judge of that. She is slow and methodical, right? She does say this, you'll be the God of my idolatry, but then she goes on to quickly say, this is all I'm doing tonight. We talked, you're here, that's kind of cool, right? It's cute, you climb the walls. But I have no joy in this contract tonight, which is line 117. I love that, right? That's so cool. She does not want to go any step further. Notice Romeo is desperate. Juliet is more taking it slow. That will change at some point. We'll see that happen. But right now, Romeo is the one who can't put the brakes on and kind of out of control. And Juliet's like, yeah, this was a good step one, right, is what she's saying. All right. I'm going to skip through the next couple pages. I think it's like that kind of romantic Greek. There might be some references to Greek stuff here. I'm not too sure. But just, you know, I love you so much. You're the most beautiful person I've ever seen, right? So I'll just kind of skip over a lot of that. Now, this is where I think Juliet starts to get this new wonder and sense, which is control over a man. He wants me, and now I have this control. Again, probably never experienced, I've never experienced that, right? Could only imagine. But she's never experienced this, and we see it in metaphor. So this is going to be lines 161, 162. Hist, Romeo, hist. Oh, for a falconer's voice to lure this tassel gentle back again. She feels like a falconer. I actually saw one of these when I was running in Moore Park here months and months ago, and this guy I was scared too because I saw these birds. I thought they were going to attack me, but he had that big glove on, and he looked like he had control of the birds. But the whole idea is that Juliet feels like the falconer and Romeo is the bird, the falcon. And she just says, you know, come back. And the bird comes back, go do this, jump this high, right? And now there's this control that she's starting to feel here, right? Very important. She expands upon it. She expands upon it all the way down into lines 182, 183. Like a poor prisoner in his twisted givvies, and with a silken thread plucked it back again. She gets this sensation that Romeo is her, or sense that Romeo is her prisoner, right? And she can just kind of pull him and do things that she needs to with him whenever she desires, right? Whenever she needs. All right, we move on. Act 2, Scene 3. I like this language here because I think it takes us back to not just the God of the day, the monotheistic God of the day, the judgmental and wrathful God of the day. Our common understanding of God nowadays is that it's like this warm, soft, fuzzy God, right? Back in the day, it wasn't, not for all people. But back in the day, it was a strict, wrathful God, right? There were just deserts, right? And I think you see a little of that here. This is lines 5 and 6. Now ere the sun advance, this is Friar Laurence speaking, by the way, Act 2, Scene 3. Now ere the sun advance his burning eye, so the sun is coming up, the real sun, the God, right? The God is coming up. The day to cheer and night's dank dew to dry, bringing cheer today, right? And what happens to the night's dank dew? And why dank dew? Because it's wet, right? It's I guess you could say vibrant and alluring and tempting, right? The things of night, right? Think about the party, the liquor, the closeness, all these things. That's going to be the dank dew. And what does that sun do? What does God do? It dries up all of that questionable behavior and conduct. It dries it up. And that's what religion does to, I guess you could say, ideologically, that's what religion does, right? It burns up all the sin. It burns up all the sinful behavior. It tries to prevent it from happening, right? It provides more of a kind of model in place. And that's what you're seeing here, right? It was quite a night, a crazy party. Think about Father Capulet at that party, all the way through to Romeo and Juliet having that moment and the words they share on that balcony, right? There was a lot of passion and desire taking place for young people, of course. We keep on going here. All right. Yeah, so God, judgment, earth, humanity, and its corruption, right? And corruption is, from a biblical standpoint, our nature, right? And it must be redeemed. It must be corrected. Okay, very good. For many virtues, excellence. Okay. Friar Laurence is like picking flowers, he's picking plants, weeds even, I think. He's kind of, all over the place. He's quite the herbalist or kind of, botanist, or maybe a combination of those things, as well as the main religious figure that we have in the text, right from the cloth. And he talks about the idea of everything having many for many virtues excellent, right? Nature provides these things, and many for many virtues are excellent. So there's a lot to gain from these things. Even though Romeo and Juliet are going to have a tragedy that occurs here, right? It's like no other. I think it's reminding us that there are some things that are good about them as individuals and good about the relationship, perhaps, that they try to cultivate here, right? They were good people, and they just got caught up in a very difficult situation where they didn't give themselves, I guess you could say, too many options. We talk about vice, right? So he quickly kind of, bridges the metaphor from plants and herbs to really just human behavior, human beings in general. And we talk about this idea of vice, and that could be another way of understanding Romeo and Juliet. Their vice, which probably is vanity. I think we're going to get a sense of that, especially as things get desperate and the situation intensifies. I think we start to see the problematic parts, the parts of their attitude, the parts of their lifestyle, right, that we could maybe view on a more negative, in a more negative way. Okay. Oh, there is a line 28. This is with the help of the text aid from the Barnes & Noble version here. Grace and rude will. It just reminds us of the two kind of forces within the world: divine influence, religion, especially, I guess you could say in a supernatural sense, and unruly human desire, right? The parts of human beings that we just let get out of control, especially desire. What do you desire? Probably coffee in the morning. Beyond that, it could be anything, right? All right. Friar Laurence, we were just speaking about lifestyle, what Romeo is accustomed to, Juliet as well. Lines 37, 38. It says, "But where unbruised youth with unstuffed brain doth couch his limbs, there golden sleep doth reign." The golden sleep he speaks of here is a privileged life. When I grew up watching cable television, we watched MTV Cribs, and it was like a huge spotlight on rich kids, rich people and rich kids. There was MTV Cribs Kids edition, and that was the hardest one to watch because they didn't even make the money. They were just lucky to be born into a rich family, right? Whatever, a successful family. But that's the golden sleep when you got nothing in the world to think about. I caution everybody from using terms like, oh, these are first world problems, right? And blah, 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 because it really, shows that you're a privileged people on this earth compared to other continents, other places throughout the world. And that's what he's talking about here. People who have nothing to worry about, right? Their lives are peachy clean. They are well fed, well sheltered. They can do anything. They have all the privileges, right? And there's varying degrees of this for everybody. But Romeo is a golden child, right? And that's so interesting because by the very end of this text, one small detail, not really a spoiler, I guess, because small, we will be erecting golden statues of these two young people after their death, right? So we're already hinting at that idea of the privileged, right? And obviously gold is well associated with that. Unbruised youth, unstuffed brain. Unbruised just means like there's nothing to really tamper with him, right? Nobody's fighting with this guy. I guess there's this feud of the Montagues and Capulets, but for the most part, if you don't get involved, you'll probably stay out of it. So unbruised and unstuffed brain. Unstuffed brain kind of is a tough one. Hasn't really shared all of his thoughts on things, right? Maybe hasn't really talked about a lot of things because he's so young. So kind of giving us a sense of Romeo and Juliet's lifestyle. We always have to remind ourselves they're rich kids. They're the rich kids in the neighborhood, right? Friar Laurence reminds us of the theme, don't fall in love through your eyes, and many young people do, is what he says. Line 67, 68, young men's love then lies, not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. That's where people fall in love. It's a great theme to have an opinion on, right? Do you agree with that? I think I could disagree with that in some respects just because of online dating and there's other ways of meeting people, but is it all about the profile pic at that point? I don't know, right? But it's all through the eyes. We get a comment on men in general, line 80. Women may fall when there's no strength in men. And I had to use the text date on that because I would have never had it. But what it's saying is men are less committed than women, right? Which seems to probably put a cast over all relationships, right, that are out there. Men commit less than women. All right. What's the friar's priority by saying that he will unite Romeo and Juliet, knowing that they come from families, two different families, these feuding families, to end the feud, right? That's what he's thinking. I think he's thinking more about that than the safety of the children at times, right? I think it's, for some reason, this feud, he's playing the bigger game here. He's playing the larger kind of field. He wants to end this whole feud. It's not about just these two young people. They're not fighting. They want to be together. So this maybe he feels like is something he can control. How could this go wrong? But obviously, there's going to be some problems, right? But I think beyond just, oh, I really want them to be together and happy, I don't even think he's that much concerned with that. I think it's more just to have this opportunity to end the entire feud. Act 2, Scene 4. All right. All right, just we open up, like many scenes in this play, with kind of this young male angst and fear of being ridiculed, especially in public, right? A lot of these things happen in public. So Mercutio is degrading Tybalt's character here, mostly for being too formal. I guess maybe formal in manners, but also formal in his sword fighting techniques. He's supposedly extremely well learned and practiced. There's no beating Tybalt. That's why when Romeo does, it's almost amazing, right, when we get there. But yeah, Tybalt's supposed to be amazing, and Mercutio doesn't like the formal etiquette and kind of refinery that's involved there. You get a sense of Mercutio's crude, more off-the-cuff kind of personality and the things that he says as you look at this particular scene. All right. they start talking about, sexual allusions here, references to the vagina, references to the penis. So we get a lot of that with Romeo and Mercutio. And one thing I just want to point out here is this. By line 65, Romeo says, switch and spurs, or I'll cry a match. So hard to know what that means without proper text dates. And you can see, it's just one version. I'm sure there's others, but it's almost just as much to read over here as you are getting through the Shakespearean kind of text on the left-hand side here. So it's very helpful. And what does that mean? Just to let you know, Romeo's saying, I've won, right? In terms of this battle of words and who's funnier and more clever, I've won. And I just want to point out the level of competition there. There's so much competition taking place in this play between the fighting. I'm going to get this girl, and now even in the banter, right, that passes between young friends here. And Mercutio, even on line 90-91, still making kind of references to sex and sexual intercourse, right? So it's a major part of how these guys speak. And I don't think if you're reading the language or covering it properly, you really get a sense of that. And I think it's important because when you think about how young men, and maybe young women, I'm not sure, but my experience with young men growing up, how they talk, this is kind of, they still talk in certain ways. Not in this type of, old, archaic Shakespearean language, but in our own ways, with our own idiomatic expressions. It's still just highly part of, I think, young men's speech. And it probably doesn't really disappear until maybe they're much older. I'm not sure. Or things in their life change. I'm not too sure. They're very rude, all right? Very rude young men, especially as the nurse comes up. I think the first thing that is said, even Romeo right off the bat is saying, he says, a sail, as the nurse kind of enters into the public square here. And what he's saying is she's so fat, she's like a boat. I mean, they're not nice kids, right? And this is Romeo who's going to have to talk to the nurse here in just a moment and start to square away a relationship with Juliet and an opportunity with Juliet. So, not the nicest kids. We talked about how Romeo is supposed to be well-mannered and such. Well, maybe when he's around people like Mercutio, who really represent that kind of body, who use kind of these body expressions and stuff, he's more like that character. It could be. Now, one thing I want to point out here, easy to pass over, and I think it lends itself to important themes. Line 1, actually the text aid between lines 165 and 168, he gives her coins. Romeo has to provide payment to the nurse, the power of money. Especially the power of money when you're a rich kid. You just throw money at everything in your whole life, right? Tip, you can tip heavily, you don't have to worry about that. Spend it on this, upgrade this, right? You just got tons of money. So he gives her payment. You might be asking, what the heck is he giving her payment for? Well, let's think about it. To basically kind of ease the way for this opportunity with Juliet, right? Keeping everybody happy, I guess you could say, right? Spread that money out. And I think we got to remember who Romeo is here, right? The rich kid who's just accustomed to these kinds of possibilities in his life. Just give her some money. All right, who else will he give money to? Now, I like to speak in totality. These aren't the kind of lectures where it's like, find out what happens next. Who else does he give money to? The apothecary at the end. That's all I'll say, but we do have the exchange of money yet again, not to mention countless references through language to money and estates and everything that money can buy, right? The earthly world that tempts us is basically what it is. All right. She takes the money. She refuses at first, and he's like, just take it. Takes the money. And right after that, he says to her, oh, and I've prepared a ladder, and I'll give you the line here, 173, and bring thee cords made like a tackled stair. And what that references is a rope ladder reminiscent of ship rigging. So like the ropes you would see on the side of ships. And it could remind you of a couple things here. We just got done with a lot of, banter from Mercutio. And Mercutio, you look at some of the kind of Latin root language there, it's merc, right, and merchant, right, as in somebody who sells, somebody who trades, a merchant. That's usually when we would have these big vessels, right, traders, or it could be military. Either kind of works here. But notice Romeo, almost in essence of expansion and trade and empire and maybe even military, wants to throw this rope over into Juliet's balcony so that he can surmount that, right? So there's a lot of aggression tied up in this idea of the ladder. And why does he, on a more literal level, why does he want the ladder? So he can get up into her balcony and he can consummate the marriage when it's done. That's almost more on his mind right now, the sex, than anything else, right? He's got to have the ladder. I don't think a lot of people even stop to acknowledge this, right? Romeo's mindset. And whether or not it's good or it's bad, we all have our own opinions here. The nurse at the very end says, last line of the act, before and apace, meaning everything's moving very fast. And I think that speaks generally to the play itself. There's a lot of plot points, there's a lot of things that occur quite rapidly, especially as we get into Act 3. Things are moving fast. Okay, this is Scene 5 and Act 2, Scene 5. We have a soliloquy from Juliet. The only thing I want to point out, and I remember first seeing this when I was working on this at a workshop at A Noise Within, which is a Shakespearean theater program based out of Pasadena. Great place. You should go and see a play there if you ever get the chance. They did a version of Romeo and Juliet where they made Romeo and Juliet homeless or something. And for me, it fell flat because the whole point is they're rich as heck, right? And they have these attitudes about life. But here we go. But she says, waiting for the nurse to return with news, she says, lines 16, 17, but old folks many fain as they were dead, unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead. She's kind of, this is what we would call ageism. So that's another big theme, or I'd say a minor theme for the text is ageism, the negative treatment and kind of ideas we have about old people within our society. And this one is pretty common, just they're old and they can't move, or they're old and they can't drive or something. She says, many feign as they were dead. Many act like they're dead. Who's going to act like they're dead in just a couple acts from now? Juliet. I love how Shakespeare does this. They are prophesizing their own dismal fate, dead, just dreary fate, and they're doing it in this criticism of old people, which tells us what Shakespeare's idea, what we shouldn't be downgrading, or I should say we shouldn't be degrading old people through our speech. We should be praising them, right? That speaks to a better society, right? Now we get into the bratty nature of these kids, the disrespectful tone they can take with elderly people, especially Juliet to the nurse. The nurse has been everything to her, more maternal, we learn, than even her mother has been. So, many feign as they were dead. That's exactly what she's going to do. She's going to be unwieldy, slow, heavy, and pale as lead after she makes a certain decision. I'll try to keep that spoiler free, but just amazing how Shakespeare does this. She's very saucy. She's very disrespectful to the nurse, asking her why she's so out of breath, right? And again, when you decide to willfully almost follow, go right into the crypt, go right into your own grave, which these two young people essentially will, it's amazing how they're criticizing somebody for being slow, but at least they still have life, because these young people won't even have life before this whole thing is over, right? Yeah, I just mentioned it. Just that we even see the physical pain of the nurse, right? The back pain, right? And there will be a very physical pain for Romeo. There will be a very, and there will be a very physical pain for Juliet. So for her to kind of, notice these things in the nurse and give her a tough time about it is very ironic, very ironic. Okay, nurse says, go act like you're going to go make a confession, and what you're really going to be doing is marrying Romeo behind your parents' back, which is pretty foul from a young person perspective. If you read the text aids in a book like this, you find out that during this time period for rich kids in a society like this, the elites, it would be a very public and formal courtship, right? Just like she's prepared to have with County Paris, right? Be seen out getting coffee, be seen out getting some food or at the lake, whatever it's going to be. Instead, and this is almost considered sinful for these young people, Romeo and Juliet, it's all on the sly, it's all on the sneak, and this would be very taboo for the time, especially people like themselves. All right, Act 2, Scene 6, which I think is the last one here, and it's quite short. Romeo, line 5, right before Juliet arrives, he says, he's kind of like, oh my gosh, I love this girl so much. And he says, that one short minute gives me in her sight. And I just want to emphasize sight. Everything, this passion, this urgency to get married, it's all been led on by sight. And what are we tempted by in terms of sight? Beauty, right? And that's maybe what generates a sense of desire here. So it's all coming through sight. What would happen if they didn't have their sight and it was like, they had to learn each other through some other means? Would it work? But the sight is, I think, the most powerful. This is the worst, I think, if you're talking about marriage speeches. I think the Friar gives the worst marriage speech, the scariest marriage speech ever. And it's right away. He even says, before Juliet arrives, these violent delights have violent ends. This is all going to end horribly. And in their triumph's an interesting word. If it's all going to end horribly, why is this a triumph? Triumph, I think, speaks to human need for greatness, right? That's what triumph is. I guess you could have triumph of God, but if you're trying to rival that sense and that greatness, it's a triumph of mankind as well. Fire and powder, kiss and consume. Kiss, and as they kiss, consume. It's a horrible way to describe the love of these young people. Like, it's basically all going to blow up like a powder keg. But Romeo doesn't seem to really say anything back to it. As Juliet's walking in, he says, so light is vanity. Earthly which means earthly happiness is insubstantial, right? These people are ready to, why are they excited, Romeo and Juliet? Is it really to have a meeting of the minds and heart and soul, what a true marriage should be based off of, which is why that courtship exists, so that they can get to know each other, right? For their own strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, which many of us have all those things, right? Or is it just sight and the need to then touch, right? What's really driving them forward? And so light is this vanity. Things on earth don't last long, right? The things that make us have, cause us to have desire, they don't last long, right? And then what do you have to fall back on? We get a couple words here that speak to our senses and the richness that we indulge in, such as sweet. I have the biggest sweet tooth, and I wish I could do something to stop it, but it's hard. And that's part of this earth, and it's a great part of this. I remember somebody said, you only live once, so definitely enjoy the sweets, right? Because it's a part of this world, and it's a good thing to experience. Right after that, that was line 26. Line 27, we have rich music. Rich as in rich in general, but also music. That's another thing of this world. What did that party have at the Capulets that kept everybody close and dancing, right? And lustful. It was music. So much music. Oh my goodness, I think the music can be too much these days, but it's to celebrate the earthly kind of pleasures, right? Our bodies, etc. Touch, closeness, romance, right? Love. Okay. Juliet makes a line here. This is line 4. And, line 32. They are but beggars that can count their worth. But my true love is grown to such excess. This love she has for Romeo, these kids will use the metaphorical experience to describe a newfound passion for each other through the things they're familiar with. And what are they familiar with? Money, right? And we get the reference to a beggar, the haves and the have-nots. Juliet and Romeo are by, extreme haves, and then we talk about beggars who are the extreme have-nots, right? The people who have nothing, which is obviously something that we have a big problem with in our society, right? A big obstacle, something that we have to deal with there, right? But she likens it to money and wealth. I cannot sum up I cannot sum up some of half my wealth. So it all comes down to money. There'll be later times when they talk about each other and they talk about mansions and estates and the things they're accustomed to, right? When Romeo belts out by the end of this play, and you know, this tomb and this bed will and the worms will be our chambermaids, right? It's a telling line. Who the heck has chambermaids? That means like people ready to wait on you hand and foot and clean your room and take you here and do this for you and da 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 da. If you have those services, at least in a neighborhood I live in, you're paying for them, right? And probably through the nose, you're paying for those services. So it shows you how wealthy this guy is, right? That they just have servants, and we have lots of servants throughout this play. They're so accustomed to this lifestyle that it's the only thing that they can really measure true love to. And I think that's an extremely sad thing and a major problem for us in our own world as well. That's the end of Act 2. I hope you're enjoying these lectures. I hope they are like unlike anything you get in classrooms. I remember talking to a girl, I mentioned it in the last one. I don't think they mentioned anything. I mean, not even idolatry, right? Which is really what this is all about in a big general sense. Thank you and have a beautiful day.